Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This video is Flight Lesson 1 in our Instrument Flight Training series. In this video we'll be talking about the basics of instrument flight. Before you start work on more complex procedures like instrument departures, arrivals, and approaches, you want to make sure to develop a good basic instrument scan and that you're proficient in basic control of your aircraft while flying solely by reference to instruments. So in this video, we'll take a look at how to develop your instrument scan and look at some of the maneuvers you can use to increase your scan proficiency and basic aircraft control while flying on instruments. I do want to offer another disclaimer before we start though. While Flight Sim can be a great tool for developing a good instrument scan and becoming familiar with and even proficient in instrument procedures, it's no substitute for real-life instrument flight experience. When you first start training on instruments, your body is going to give you a lot of misinformation about which way is up, down, left, or right. It takes a proficient instrument pilot a lot of practice and discipline to ignore these bodily sensations and learn to trust their flight instruments. While Flight Simulator is an amazing product that's truly getting close to making it as real as it can get on a computer or game console, no simulator will ever be able to replicate all of the sensations you'll feel during actual flight. Even the multi-million-dollar full-motion simulators used by professional flight departments don't fully replicate the sensation of flight. And Microsoft Flight Simulator is not in any way certified by the FAA as a flight training device. So please, whether you're a new sim pilot or an experienced real-world pilot, don't assume that being proficient with Flight Sim will make you proficient in the real world. Make sure to get the appropriate amount of real-world training, experience, and certification before launching into real clouds on your own, and always be aware of and follow all applicable regulations. Before we talk about instrument flying, let's talk about the difference between that and visual flying. To this point on this channel, we've been dealing primarily with visual flying, or flight under visual flight rules, or VFR. VFR flying offers a great deal of freedom and fewer regulations than instrument flying, but it does limit the conditions we can go flying in. When we want to fly in the clouds or any weather conditions that are less than VFR, we have to adhere to instrument flight rules, or IFR. In the real world, this typically requires that we file a flight plan, get a clearance, and then carefully follow ATC instructions. This shouldn't be confused with actually being in the clouds or not. Anytime you're in weather conditions where you can safely control the aircraft by outside references, you are said to be in visual meteorological conditions, or VMC. If you're in weather that's less than that required to fly VFR, you're in instrument meteorological conditions, or IMC. It's perfectly fine to fly under instrument flight rules in VMC conditions. Many corporate flight departments and most airlines do this all the time. Flying under VFR into IMC conditions can also happen, but more often than not, this is done either unintentionally or illegally and is dangerous and often fatal. In order to legally operate in IMC under instrument flight rules, or IFR, you need an instrument rating. An instrument rating is a rating that can be added to most private or commercial pilot certificates. This rating allows the holder to operate a specific category and/or class of aircraft under instrument flight rules, or IFR. In the real world, the requirements for applying for an instrument airplane rating in the U.S. include having at least a private pilot certificate, being able to read, speak, write, and understand the English language, having at least 50 hours of cross-country time as pilot in command. This includes at least 10 hours of cross-country time as PIC in an airplane, having a total of 40 hours of actual or simulated instrument time. This has to include at least 15 hours of instrument flight training in an airplane, and it may include a maximum of 20 hours in a certified simulator or flight training device, which again, Microsoft Flight Simulator is not, and having at least 3 hours of instruction and preparation for the practical tests. You need to pass a knowledge test with a minimum score of 70%, and then you need to pass an oral exam and practical test or check ride. Before we dive into the training, I want to mention that I'll be conducting this instrument training series in the Cessna 172. It's a nice, stable aircraft that's not difficult to fly and makes a very good instrument trainer. If you're not familiar with the 172, I do have a series of 2 checkout videos on the aircraft you can take a look at, and I'll leave a link to those videos in this video's description. The first video is an overview of the systems on the 172, and the second is the flight checkout, where we'll cover the maneuvers that you'll want to be familiar with to be proficient with the aircraft. We'll even use a few of those maneuvers in this lesson. There are 2 versions of the 172 available in Microsoft Flight Simulator. The G1000 or glass panel version is available in the standard edition of the sim. There's also what's referred to as the steam gauge version of the aircraft, which features traditional analog instruments and smaller, older Garmin GPS units. This version of the aircraft is only available in the deluxe edition. With these 2 different versions of the aircraft, something you'll want to think about before you start instrument training is whether you want to learn on traditional analog or steam gauge instruments, or whether you want to fly using a glass cockpit. I do recommend that you stick with either one or the other for the entirety of your primary instrument training, and there are, of course, pros and cons to each. Learning on a traditional analog panel might be a little more difficult at first. Your scan will be more spread out than on a glass panel, and you won't have as much information to help you with positional and situational awareness as you would with a glass panel. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. You'll likely develop a solid scan in the long term, and developing a sense of positional awareness without the aid of something like a moving map is an extremely valuable skill that's becoming more rare in today's glass cockpit world. The downside is that if you decide to transition to glass, it is a slightly different scan than with analog, and it will take a little time to develop that scan, though most pilots make the transition without too much trouble. With a glass cockpit, your scan will be more compact and will likely develop a little faster. You also have a wealth of information available to you that's not available to a steam gauge pilot, though this can be a little overwhelming for a new instrument pilot. You'll also have superior positional and situational awareness from the get-go with the moving map available to you, but that can be a downside as well, as many glass panel pilots have poor situational awareness if you take their moving map away. It also typically takes a pilot that did their initial training on glass a little more time and effort to transition to analog gauges, and again, their situational awareness can be poor without a moving map. There's no right or wrong answer to which aircraft you train in, and a lot of it depends on your personal preference and what kind of aircraft you intend to fly once you've finished your training. I'll be covering how to fly all of the maneuvers and procedures in both versions of the aircraft. Most of the basic maneuvers we'll do in this lesson will be exactly the same in both aircraft, but flying instrument procedures such as departures, arrivals, and approaches will be slightly different between the 2 different versions. If you do want to go full old school analog, I do recommend turning the display on the GNS 530 and 430 to pages other than the moving map, so you develop that positional awareness without any crutches. If you're going to go with glass, I do recommend turning the synthetic vision off. Using synthetic vision is basically like looking out the window, so if you're using it, you're not really learning to fly on instruments. I'll also mention that the GPS in the G1000 NXI panel functions more accurately than do the GNS 530 and 430 units in the Steam Gauge 172. This is primarily a factor for RNAV or GPS approaches. With the G1000 unit, these approaches and the way you load and fly them are pretty true to the way the real-life unit would work. That's not to say that you can't fly these approaches with the 530 and 430, but at the time this video was filmed, there are quite a few things with these units that are not accurate about the way you use them. They also use Flight Sim's default nav system, which can be quirky and frustrating to use. Working Title is working on a mod that will bring these units up to par with the realism they put into the G1000, but I don't know what sort of timeline they're looking at for releasing that. So if being able to accurately load and fly GPS approaches is a high priority for you during your instrument training, using the G1000 panel is probably your best bet. So how do you develop a good instrument scan? In this lesson, we'll be focusing on the method of flying referred to as attitude instrument flying, or the control performance method. In this method, the attitude indicator or artificial horizon will be the focus or center of your scan. The attitude indicator basically replaces the view of the horizon you get out of the front of the window, hence its other name, the artificial horizon. It's the only instrument that will give you data on two axes of flight simultaneously, pitch and roll. A good instrument scan will center on the attitude indicator, and studies have indicated that proficient instrument pilots spend close to 75% of their scan time on that instrument, momentarily radiating out to the other instruments to confirm what you've done with the attitude indicator is working, often in a hub and spoke type scan pattern. Your attitude indicator is the instrument you control, with the other instruments giving you performance information. It's also important to understand what information all of the instruments are giving you. Your airspeed indicator, attitude indicator, altimeter, and VSI all provide you with pitch information, meaning that if your pitch changes, you'll see changes on these instruments. Your attitude indicator, turn coordinator or turn rate indicator on a glass panel, heading indicator or HSI on a glass panel all give you roll information. And you can see changes in power on your tachometer or other engine power instruments like manifold pressure gauges, depending on the aircraft type you're flying, as well as your airspeed indicator. Experienced attitude instrument pilots will often tell you that pitch plus power equals performance. In reality, it's actually attitude plus power plus configuration equals performance. This means that if you set a given attitude, power setting, and configuration, you should get predictable performance from the rest of your instruments. And this will generally work for all aircraft, from light single-engine aircraft to heavy jets. For example, I know that if I'm in the 172, that if I set a level pitch or 0 degrees of pitch, level roll attitude or 0 degrees of roll, and set a clean configuration or 0 degrees of flaps, flaps up, and between 2400 and 2500 RPM on the power, I know that that will give me a level flight at cruise airspeed. So I know my performance from my instruments will be about 105 to 110 knots on my airspeed indicator. I should not get a climb on my altimeter or VSI, and I shouldn't get a turn on my heading indicator or my turn coordinator. I know that if I set a level pitch attitude, about 17 degrees of bank, about set 0 degrees of flaps or clean configuration on the flaps, flaps up, and 2400 to 2500 RPM, I know that I will get a standard rate level turn at cruise airspeed. And we'll talk more about what a standard rate turn is here in just a little bit. And I also know that if I set just under level pitch, if I set about 2 degrees pitch down, if I keep that roll level at 0 degrees of bank, and I put in 30 degrees of flaps, and then I put in a power setting of between 2000 to 2100 RPM, that once everything stabilizes, I should get a 350 foot per minute descent straight ahead at my approach speed of 70 knots, which is about what I need to fly an ILS. So much of instrument flying is learning how to set your attitude, power, and configuration for the maneuver or procedure you want to accomplish, and then making adjustments from that setting to fine-tune things. To develop your instrument scan and become proficient at controlling the aircraft by reference to instruments, there are a few basic maneuvers you want to practice. These include straight and level cruise flight, level standard rate turns at cruise speed, and again we'll talk about what a standard rate turn is here in just a little bit. And you can also practice what we call half standard rate turns as well, which are good for making fine-tuned adjustments to your heading. Constant airspeed climbs, this would be climbing at something like VY or 74 knots in the Cessna 172, and this includes both a level wings level climb and a turning climb. Constant airspeed descents at cruise speed. This would be setting your cruise speed, then adjusting your power so that you're descending at a constant airspeed. A constant rate descent at cruise speed, both level and turning for both of those maneuvers. This is where you're trying to adjust your power to get a particular rate of descent, say a 500 foot per minute descent. Level flight at approach speed in your landing configuration. This is what you want to do to set up for a instrument approach just prior to you starting down on the final segment. You'll typically configure your aircraft for landing and fly level in that landing configuration at the approach speed before you start the descent. You also want to practice turning flight at this approach speed in the landing configuration just to get used to how the aircraft feels as you make turns in this configuration and at this speed. A constant rate descent at approach speed, and again in your landing configuration. This is something you want to practice again to do something like an ILS or an instrument approach. This is actually practicing the portion where you're descending on that final approach segment. And again, you want to do this in both level and turning flight, and you probably want to practice it with a standard rate turn, a half standard rate turn, and then an even smaller turn where you're only doing about 5 degrees or bank or so, which is a correction turn, which is where you're trying to fine tune your heading to keep on course on that approach. You also want to practice an idle descent at approach speed in the landing configuration, again, both level and turning. And this is practicing for what we call the dive and drive type approaches, where you hit your final approach fix and you want to descend as quickly as you can down to a minimum descent altitude and then level off at an MDA. You also want to practice the missed approach and go around maneuver. There are also some performance maneuvers that you'll need to do as well. These include steep turns. Just like with VFR flight, steep turns will help you develop more precise pitch and bank control and will help you to quicken your scan and get more proficient with it. You'll also want to perform a stall recovery series, both power on and power off stalls, so you know you can recognize and recover from a stall in instrument conditions. Neither of these maneuvers are required on instrument check rides, but most instructors and most instrument training curricula will include them in the syllabus, so expect to see them at least once or twice during your training. As you practice your maneuvers, it's important to be aware of the 3 common instrument scan errors. These are fixation, omission, and emphasis. Fixation is where you stare at a single instrument and forget about the rest. An example of this will be focusing on the airspeed indicator to make sure you're on speed during level flight at approach speed and not noticing that you've started descending on your VSI and altimeter. Omission is where you leave an instrument or instruments out of your scan, like the altimeter and the VSI in the previous example. As you can see, fixation and omission are closely related. The final error is emphasis, when you're not staring at one instrument or group of instruments, but you're spending more time looking at them than any of the other instruments, which again can lead to omission. Some instructors recommend trying to develop a rhythm to your scan, something like counting to 3 every time you start looking at a new instrument, so you're aware if you're spending too much time looking at one particular instrument. As you get more advanced in your training, you'll need to expand your scan to include things like your nav radio displays if you're flying en route or performing approaches, your clock or timer if you're doing a timed approach, and it's always a good idea to get into the habit of giving your engine and fuel gauges a glance every now and again to make sure everything is operating normally and your fuel situation is okay. Developing an instrument scan can be done differently by different pilots. The important thing is to develop a method that works for you and then get plenty of practice to become proficient. As far as proficiency standards go for instrument flying, you can consider yourself proficient when you can maintain your altitude plus or minus 100 feet in level flight, maintain your selected heading plus or minus 10 degrees when you're not in a turn, maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, whether you're in cruise flight or whether you're flying at your approach speed, and then maintain your bank angle plus or minus 5 degrees during turns. All right, so let's go ahead and set up a flight to go up and practice our maneuvers. So go ahead and click on the world map. We will set up our aircraft over on the far left here. So aircraft selection, again, you can choose between the Cessna 172, the Classic Edition, if you have the Deluxe Edition of Flight Simulator, or you can stick with the 172 G1000 Edition, again, depending on your preference between glass and steam and whether or not you have the Deluxe Edition. The weight and balance we will set up so that we have 2 full tanks of gas and 2 170-pound passengers should work just fine. As far as the airport, we'll go ahead and use our home base of Kilo Papa Bravo Foxtrot, so Pine Bluff Regional Airport that we've been using for the training for the private pilot, and we will take off from runway 18. And then as far as date and time, I'm going to set a mid-June day, and I will set it at noon to have good lighting, and then we'll go ahead and get in the sim and we'll set up the weather from there. All right, so for the weather settings, we'll go ahead and create a little bit of instrument weather for ourselves. I'm going to change my altitude calculation over to AMSL so that will set the clouds where they will be on my altimeter. If you haven't looked at my video on setting weather, I do have a video out there for controlling the weather in Microsoft Flight Simulator that does have some tips and tricks on how to set up your clouds and other weather settings, particularly for instrument flying. And I'll leave a link to that video in this video's description. But I will be going through lesson by lesson and telling you how to set up the weather for that lesson so that it works for that particular maneuver or approach, whatever we're doing in that instrument lesson. So we've got our altitude calculation at AMSL. We won't mess with the precipitation, snow, or lightning. I have my temperature over here set to where I can read it in 14 degrees Celsius, and so I'm going to adjust that temperature so that it is about 20 degrees C on the ground. You can see that's about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Pressure I'll keep standard at 2,992, won't mess with the humidity. And what this does for us here is it sets the freeze level up about 10,000 feet, so I will not have to worry about icing unless I get up to or above 10,000 feet in the cloud, so we won't have to worry about that. Then I'll go ahead and click on my cloud layer here. I'll click on the lowest one. I'll go ahead and set the coverage to 100%, which will provide us with an overcast. I'll leave density at 1. I'll leave the scatter where it is, and then I'm going to pull the tops up to around 12,000 feet. That should mean we should get up to we'd have to get up to probably above 10,000 before we break out the tops. And then I'm going to set the bottoms here to about 2,500 feet. And that will set us a good thick cloud cover, and it will get us into the clouds around 2,000 feet or so. We'll start to lose sight of the ground, and then by the time we get to 3,000, we won't have much ground contact, and straight ahead will be instrument conditions. This will also allow us to get back in visually if we want to do that. You can set the clouds lower if you want a little bit of a foggy takeoff, but this is where I'm setting them for demonstration purposes. I'll also mention that I do have some camera angles set up specifically for instrument flying. I do have my first camera set up so that I look out the windshield and have a good view of the instrument panel and the GPS. This is just a VFR flight setting here. I have another angle that tilts down to where I can see the flaps, the mixture, the throttle, and the switches. And then specifically for instrument flying, I have a view that zooms in on the instrument panel so that I can see from the GPS over to the engine gauges. And again, this is good for instrument flying. It does have this little corner up here where I'm not hiding the outside world, but that's not enough for me to get enough of a visual cue when I'm flying to really compromise my instrument view. And then the last view I have is just zooming straight in on just the flight instruments, the tachometer, and the instruments. If I want to take away my moving map, then I can do that to just navigate on the basic instruments here. And if you're using the G1000 model, there are a couple of custom camera settings that I do recommend setting up. My number one camera setting is what you see right here, which gives you a good VFR view out the window, but still gives you a good view of the G1000 panel. And then I have a view that tilts down so you can see flaps, mixture, and switches. And then number 3 is a good IFR view where you have a good view of both the PFD and the MFD. The fourth view I have zooms in on just the PFD if you want to focus just on the instruments for something like flying an instrument approach and don't want to look at the moving map. And then the fifth setting I have in there is focusing on the MFD for doing things like loading approaches and taking a close view at the map and loading flight plans and things like that. So those are some of the settings for the cameras that I like for flying instruments on the 172 G1000 edition. I'll also mention before we take off that after you start your engine as you're taxiing out, there are a couple of things that you want to look at and a couple of checks you want to perform as you're taxiing out that are specific to instrument flying. Obviously, you want to check your instruments and make sure that they're doing what they need to do or not doing something that they don't need to do. So as you're taxiing out, take a look at the airspeed indicator, make sure it's indicating 0. Make sure that when you started your engine, your attitude indicator came up within, I think it's 30 seconds, and make sure that it's aligned. And then, of course, you can use this little knob right here at the center of the attitude to adjust to make sure that when you're level, that your wings are lined up with the horizon here. You want to check your altimeter setting and make sure that when you're on the ground at the airport, that when you have the altimeter set, it reads the field elevation on the altimeter. As you're taxiing out, you can do little turns to look at your turn coordinator, and the turn coordinator should bank in the direction that you're turning, and then the ball should swing to the outside of your turn. The heading indicator as you're turning should also turn as well, and you want to make sure that that is centered up with whatever your compass indicates, and then make sure that your VSI is not indicating a climb or descent. I also like to move my heading bug to whatever my initial heading after takeoff is going to be, just so I have a reference, and that completes the instrument checks. Obviously, you're not going to have probably instrument failures in Flight Simulator unless you choose to have instrument failures, and really for instrument failures in Flight Sim, you do need to use a third-party app. You can't fail them, I think, in the native menu. So everything is going to work. So whether you do those checks in Flight Sim is up to you, but that is the standard instrument check that you want to do on a classic panel in real life as you're taxiing out. So the checks that you want to do on the G1000 panel, or the ones that you want to do in real life, are make sure that both screens are operative and that both displays are functioning properly. Make sure that all of the instruments are displaying, particularly the flight instruments, and that you don't have any data fields that are not displaying or have X's on them to make sure that all your data is valid. Then once everything is powered up, you can check and make sure that your airspeed is 0, the attitude indicator is level. Set your altimeter and make sure that it is within 75 feet of field elevation. And then as you're taxiing out, you can do your turn checks. Again, the turn or the HSI on this aircraft should turn and face appropriate headings that you can check with the compass as you're making your turns. And then the inclinometer or the turn slip indicator at the top of the attitude indicator that replaces the turn coordinator ball should go to the outside of the turns as you're making turns on the ground, just like the ball on the turn coordinator would on a traditional turn coordinator instrument. You also want to take a chance or take a moment to take a look at your standby instruments. Make sure that the airspeed indicator there is reading 0. Make sure that that attitude indicator is up and there's no flags, and make sure that that altimeter is set and again reading within 75 feet of field elevation. And in the real world, if we were going flying IFR, even on a training flight, if we're going in the clouds, we would need to file a flight plan and get an IFR clearance. So we'll assume that we filed a flight plan. We filed a very simple one. We just filed from Pine Bluff back to Pine Bluff and put in the remarks that we're going to be doing instrument training maneuvers so that the air traffic controller knows that we're going to be up doing climbs, descents, turns, and those sorts of things once we get airborne. And so we would call up air traffic control here on the ground at Pine Bluff. We can get a hold of Little Rock Approach, and we'll assume that they give us this clearance. They tell us that Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, you're cleared to Pine Bluff as filed. On departure, fly runway heading, climb maintain 3000, squawk 5502. So we'll enter our squawk code in our transponder. We read that clearance back to them. And then since it's an uncontrolled field, they would actually probably give us a hold for release, meaning we can't take off until we've contacted them. We're holding short of the runway and we're number 1. But we'll talk more in detail about that with when we get to regulations and things like that. So we'll assume that we've gotten our release. We'll go ahead and take off and get in the air and do our instrument maneuvers. One last thing I'll mention before we take off is that I do have the glare shield lights up here just above the instruments turned on. This was actually set up by default in the 172 Classic, even on a bright sunny day for some reason. But I realized that with those lights on, it is easier to see the instruments, and I think it'll come through better in the video for everybody watching. So not something you necessarily have to do, but for the video, it does make it easier to see. And if you're having difficulty seeing the instruments on this airplane, it's something you might want to consider doing just to get a better picture of the instruments, a better visibility on the instruments. So we'll assume we've gotten our IFR release from air traffic control. So once your before takeoff checks are done, go ahead and perform a normal takeoff. With the weather set as we've got it, you'll start climbing into the clouds around 2,000 feet, but you can shift to an instrument camera view at about 500 feet above the ground if you'd like to. We'll assume that we contact ATC once we're airborne. They let us know that we're in radar contact, verify our mode C altitude, and verify that we can continue the climb on runway heading to 3,000 feet. So as you bring yourself inside the airplane here, you can transition right to a constant airspeed climb. You can see I've got my pitch set just a little bit under 10 degrees, about 7.5 degrees right now is working out pretty well. It's getting me just a little bit over 74 knots right now, about 75 knots. And you'll notice that the flight sim is just a little bit sensitive on the pitch. If I make a small change in my yoke, it does result in a pretty big change in my pitch attitude. And that's something that's fairly common with simulators. A lot of times they're a little more sensitive than the aircraft actually is. It will make you, in the long run, a more proficient pilot though. And as I'm climbing up there, I'm maintaining my pitch. I am using my trim to keep my pitch where I want it, so I'm not having to constantly hold pressure on the controls. And then for my heading, I'm just using a small, about, just leaning halfway between the two tick marks there, which is about 5 degrees of bank, to make corrections and keep myself on my heading. Just like with VFR flying, you want to lead your level off by about 10% of your rate of climb. So since I'm doing about 600 feet per minute in the climb, I want to start to gently pitch to level about 60 feet before my assigned altitude of 3,000 feet. Once I'm level, I'll let the airplane accelerate to cruise speed of about 105 to 110 knots of indicated airspeed, again trimming to keep the control pressure off. Then I'll set my cruise power to 2,400 to 2,500 RPM. And once you've got it leveled out and trimmed out and stabilized at cruise flight, just take a couple minutes to fly straight and level. Just take a look at your instruments, try to center on that attitude indicator, and then radiate momentarily out to those other instruments to make sure everything is doing what you want it to do. And then for straight and level, you just want to make very small corrections. For instance, my altitude is about 20 feet low right now. So all I want to do is just pull just a little gently on the stick, get it going up 100, maybe 200 feet per minute, to get it reset there, and then give it a little push down back to that level pitch attitude to stay on that altitude. Likewise, I'm slightly right of my heading, not by much, just a couple degrees. So I'm just going to give it the tiniest little turn here, about 1 or 2 degrees of bank. It'll be enough to get it over and rotate that heading indicator slowly. And then once I'm back on the heading, I'll go ahead and level out. Once you've leveled out, you can go ahead and do a cruise check if you want, and then you can lean the mixture if you want. I'm not going to lean it today just because we're going to be doing a lot of maneuvering, but if you wanted to go through that, you can. Just don't forget to keep your instrument scan going on while you're doing that. After you're good and comfortable with straight and level, the next maneuver you want to move into is just normal standard rate turns to heading. Let's talk a little bit about what a standard rate turn is and how that works. A standard rate turn is defined as a turn at a rate of 3 degrees of heading change per second. This will have you completing a 360-degree turn in 2 minutes, which is why the turn coordinator on a steam gauge panel is labeled 2 men under the ball. You should use a standard rate turn most of the time you're flying on instruments. It's the turn rate that ATC expects your aircraft to perform, and it's the turn rate that will work best for instrument procedures like holding patterns and procedure turns. About the only time you don't want to use a standard rate turn is when you're making small heading or course corrections. To execute a standard rate turn on a steam gauge airplane, bank until your airplane symbol and your turn coordinator lines up with the lower white line in the direction you wish to turn. On a glass panel, you can execute a standard rate turn by banking until the magenta turn rate indicator hits the second tick mark to the left or right at the top of the HSI. You can also do some math if you want to figure out what bank angle will give you a standard rate turn. To do this, you want to divide your true airspeed by 10 and then add half of that value to that answer or multiply that answer by 1.5. An example of this would be if you have an aircraft that's doing 100 knots of true airspeed, 100 divided by 10 is 10. Half of 10 is 5, so we can add that to 10 or multiply 10 times 1.5, and that tells us that 15 degrees of bank will give us a standard rate turn, and that in that aircraft at that speed. If we are flying a little slower, say we're doing approaches in the 172 and we're doing a true airspeed of 70 knots, 70 divided by 10 is 7, half of 7 is 3.5. So if we add 3.5 to 7 or we multiply 7 times 1.5, that tells us that we're going to need just a shade over 10 degrees of bank to get a standard rate turn at that speed. Final example, if we have a faster aircraft that has a true airspeed of 160 knots, 160 divided by 10 is 16. Half of 16 is 8, so if we add that to 16 or multiply 16 times 1.5, that gets us 24 degrees of bank to get a standard rate turn. As you can see, the slower your airspeed is, the less bank you'll need for a standard rate turn, and the faster you go, the more bank you'll need to get a standard rate of turn. As you get into aircraft that fly faster than 200 knots of true airspeed, standard rate turns are no longer used since the bank angles required would be over 30 degrees, which would be a little uncomfortable for most passengers. Most of these airplanes just use a bank angle of between 25 and 30 degrees as a standard instead, and you typically won't see a turn coordinator or turn rate indicator on their panel. So before we begin our maneuvers, we'll assume that we do get ATC clearance to maneuver. We call up and ask them for clearance to maneuver, and they respond with a clearance. They say Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, you're cleared to maneuver as desired, maintain block altitude of 2,000 to 7,000 feet, and advise ready to return to Pine Bluff. So now we have our ATC clearance. The other thing I'll mention before we start maneuvering is, I think most of you know this, but we do want to do most of this lesson, pretty much all of this lesson, without the autopilot, and I would recommend without the flight director on the G1000 if you're using that. Watching the autopilot fly is not going to help you develop a good scan. So I don't really care if we use autopilot for when we start learning procedures, approaches, and things like that. But for learning your basic instrument scan, it is best to leave the autopilot off. So the first thing I do before I go into a turn is move my heading bug in the 172 over to the heading that I want to fly. This is a good standard practice when you're flying on instruments. Anytime you're getting vectored by ATC or want to fly a certain heading is to bug it, just so you have a reference of where you want to go. Again, it's a personal preference, but it is a good operational practice that I think a lot of instrument pilots use. Once I've moved that heading bug over, I'm going to do a left turn to a heading of 090. I'll just roll right in. I know it's going to be about 17 degrees of bank, just shy of 20 degrees of bank. So I roll over until my turn coordinator is level with the mark for the standard rate turn, focusing on my attitude indicator, glancing at my VSI and my altimeter, and going back and forth between those instruments. I want to roll out at about half my angle of bank, so about 10 degrees prior. I'll start the rollout process, slowly roll back over to 0 degrees of bank, and we are now on our heading. And that'll just make a small correction if I overshoot the heading, just a couple degrees of bank to get it back on the heading. So that's how you want to do a standard rate turn when you're flying on instruments. And just remember to keep that scan going, and then once you're on the heading, use those small corrections. And as you're practicing your turns, practice turns at a standard rate both to the left and to the right, and then you can also practice half standard rate turns. So I'm going to do a half standard rate turn over to the right, over back to heading of 180, and to do a half standard rate, just bank until your turn coordinator is halfway between the level mark and the standard rate turn mark. And you can also practice doing smaller banks than that, doing about between 2.5 and 5 degrees of bank, just to make those small heading changes. So practice 90-degree turns, and then practice some smaller turns to practice about turning between 10 and 30 degrees, using smaller angles of banks to do things that you would do, like doing course corrections to get on a VOR radial or tracking a course on the initial portion of an instrument approach. As you're doing this, make sure to keep focusing on that scan, keep moving between the instruments, try not to fixate on one instrument, try not to omit any instruments, and try to be aware if you're emphasizing any particular set of instruments. Once you feel comfortable with standard rate turns, go ahead and try some steep turns. The procedure is the same for flying them on instruments as it is for flying them visually. Make sure you're at or below your maneuver speed, and then smoothly roll into a 45-degree banked turn of 360 degrees while increasing your power about 100 RPM or so. Steep turns are a good way to quicken your scan, learn to divide your attention between your instruments, and practice precise control of your pitch and bank. Don't forget to lead your rollout by about 20 degrees and reduce your power as you roll out. All right, so for our next set of maneuvers, we're going to climb up to 5,000, and we'll go ahead and make this a climbing turn. So we'll assume we got a clearance, climb, maintain 5,000, turn left to a heading of 090, and it's good to get these practice at these climbing turns for things like departure. So I'll go ahead and I will put full power in. I'll pitch up to just under 10 degrees, and then I will trim it, and I'll let the aircraft stabilize at 74 knots, and then I'll go ahead and bank to get myself a standard rate turn. And now I've got to divide my attention between the attitude indicator, the heading indicator, the turn coordinator, and the airspeed indicator to make sure that everything is going where I want it to go. So I got my bank in for my turn. I have my pitch in, and we'll get stabilized at 74 knots here in just a second. I'll lead my rollout by half my angle of bank, so there's 090. I'll go ahead and roll out of that turn. And now I'll just maintain my pitch to maintain 74 knots. And just like with any other level off, I want to lead the level off by about 10% my rate of climb. I'm doing about 700 feet a minute. So I will start to pitch down and let the aircraft accelerate when I get to about 70 to 80 feet from my altitude. And so right now I'm just pitching to maintain that 70 knots, adjusting to stay at that 74 knots, that best rate of climb speed, and making small adjustments as I climb, making small adjustments in my bank to stay on the heading, and just continually scanning and adjusting my pitch and my bank to get the airspeed that I want, setting the attitude that I want, and then making small adjustments from there. So I'm just a little bit slow on the speed, so I'll drop the pitch just a little bit and let the aircraft gain speed again. And then once I'm at that speed, I'll readjust my pitch. It looks like just a little bit over 5 degrees, just putting the ball right on the top of that 5-degree mark is what's holding 74 knots for me. And as I get within 80 to 60 feet, I'll go ahead and start a slow pitch over to level off to level pitch. I'll let the aircraft accelerate, and then once it's accelerated to the cruise speed, I'll go ahead and adjust that power. Don't forget to adjust your trim as well, so you can fly hands off and not have to work quite as hard. So now that we've reached 5,000, we'll go ahead and practice a descent. There's two ways you can do descents. You can do a constant airspeed descent, or you can do a constant rate descent. Obviously, with the constant airspeed descent, you want to maintain a constant airspeed. A lot of times this will be an idle power descent, and you'll just pull the power to idle and pitch to maintain your airspeed, and you take whatever vertical speed you get. And then with a constant rate descent, you want to reduce your power and pitch to stay on your cruise airspeed of about 105 knots or so, and then adjust your power so that you get the rate of descent that you want. So we'll try a level descent, we'll try a idle descent first. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and pull my power all the way to idle, and then I will pitch down to maintain my airspeed. You can see I have to pitch down a pretty good amount, and the aircraft is going to come down at a pretty good rate with an idle power descent. So I'm pitching, I'm just shy of 100 knots right now, and you can see the aircraft is coming down pretty quickly. It's coming down at about a little under 2,000 feet per minute. This is probably a little overdone for what the aircraft will actually do in real life, but I'm just pitching to maintain that 105 knots, and I'm doing an idle power descent. We'll descend to maintain 3,000 with this maneuver, and just like with a VFR descent, we will lead the level off with power, again 10% of your rate of descent, so about 150 feet at the rate of descent we currently have going, and we'll start to add that power back in to level off at 3,000. Again, making small changes in pitch to maintain that about 105 knots. There comes 250 feet, so we got a little ways to go here. There's 150 feet, so I'll gently start to add that power back into the cruise power of 2,500 RPMs, and my nose kind of comes up on its own. So I really don't have to pitch that hard. I just kind of monitor the attitude indicator to make sure that the aircraft returns to the pitch that I want on its own. So that is an idle power descent. Let's talk about a constant rate descent. So with a constant rate descent, we're going to be less aggressive with our initial power reduction. We'll pull it back to about 1,900 RPMs, and then we'll again pitch to maintain that 105 knots or so, and then we'll adjust the power to get about a 500 foot per minute descent is what we'll target. And then you can see how you can adjust your power to maintain the rate of descent that you want while pitching to maintain your airspeed. So we'll make that initial power reduction to about 1,900 RPMs. We'll pitch down to maintain 105 knots, and you can see our rate of descent is a little faster than we want right now. We'll let it kind of stabilize here. We're doing about 1,500 feet a minute. Our power has also dropped down a little bit here, so we'll just add a little bit of power in. Go up to about 2,100 RPMs, and again we'll pitch up to get 105 knots. So there's about a 400 foot per minute descent, about a 300 foot per minute descent. We'll come back to about 2,000 RPMs. We're getting a little bit off our speed, so we'll pitch down for that speed. And you see, it takes a lot of finesse between the power and the pitch to get it exactly where you want to. Try making changes of 100 RPM or so initially, just to get it locked into where you want it. So you can see we've got 105 knots right now. We've got a little more rate of descent than we really want, so we're going to add just a little more power. Again, I'm finessing that pitch to try to get it exactly where I want it. So it looks like about 2,100 RPMs is getting me 500 feet per minute at about 105 knots. So again, you just kind of play with the combination of pitch and power to get it where you want to maintain the rate of descent that you want at the airspeed that you want. And you just want to come out here and practice these descents and just practice kind of playing around with the pitch and the power and getting, adjust your rate of descent to 500 feet per minute. Try doing a 700 foot per minute descent. Try maybe doing a 300 foot per minute descent, and just constantly play around with that power and pitch combination until you get what you want, and try targeting different things. Another thing you'll want to do when practicing descents is practice doing turning descents. Remember that you're going to lose some of your vertical lift when you enter a turn, so you'll probably need to increase the power just slightly. But you also want to practice those turning descents because you will get descents in a turn quite often in IFR flying. So make sure that you practice those and are comfortable with those. And the level off from a constant rate descent is exactly the same as it is an idle power descent at about 10% of your rate of descent, so about 50 feet from your desired altitude. Just bring that power in. The nose should come up naturally on its own. Just monitor the attitude indicator, make sure it's trending in the right direction, and then apply cruise power as you get to your altitude, and then just manage your pitch and power from there. So there's about 50 feet, so I'll smoothly start to bring that power back in to about 2,500 RPM. The nose kind of naturally tilts up on its own, and then I just maintain that pitch that gives me a 0 rate of climb, and finesse my pitch and my power from there, and don't forget to trim. So we're back up at 5,000 feet again, and what we're going to do now is practice doing level flight at our approach speed. Our approach speed in this airplane, we're going to use 70 knots. The book says between 60 and 70 knots, but the autopilots say minimum speed of 70 knots, so that's what we'll use as our approach speed on both the 172 Classic and the G1000 edition. And the reason we practice this is because this is what you're going to do typically when you first start flying instrument approaches. You're going to be level at an altitude prior to hitting your final approach fix, and you'll want to slow down to your approach speed in level flight and then begin your descent on your final approach segment. So as you get more advanced, you can start to slow down as you go down on that final approach segment, but initially when you start to practice those approaches, it's better to slow down while you're level and then descend on the final approach segment. So to slow down on the 172, what we'll do is drop the power back to about 1900 RPMs. We'll pay careful attention to our pitch to make sure we are not descending. Let the airplane start to slow. We're already below 110 knots, which is our first flap limitation speed, so we'll go ahead and bring flaps out to 10 degrees. And then be aware that you're going to get some ballooning as that happens. Once you're below 85, then go ahead and bring that second notch out. And then once you're pretty well stabilized from that, bring your third notch out. And then you're going to need to bring the power up pretty close to max power, close to about 2,400 RPMs to maintain level flight at 70 knots. So about 2,400 RPMs. You'll notice the pitch is slightly above level pitch, just a hair, maybe a couple of degrees. And our power is between 24 and 2,500 RPM to maintain 70 knots. So just practice this level flight with landing configuration at your approach speed for a few minutes until you're comfortable with that. And once you're comfortable with that, go ahead and try some turns in this configuration. And it's a good idea to do standard rate turns, half standard rate turns, and then very small turns to practice course correcting on an approach. You'll notice when I do a standard rate turn, it takes a lot less bank to get a standard rate turn. It was about almost 20 degrees. Now it's just a little over 10 degrees to get that standard rate turn. So get some practice with that. Again, this is good for dividing your instruments. If you notice that you are slowing down but you're not descending, then add in a little more power to get back on that speed. And if you're slowing down and going up, then you've pitched up a little too much, and then you want to pitch down before you add the power back in. But just play around with that, make some turns at that speed, make some smaller turns at that speed, and just practice flying the airplane and getting a feel for how the airplane feels at that slower speed. So the next maneuver we want to practice in this configuration is a descent in the landing configuration, and this is going to be what we would do on a typical approach when we are descending on final approach. This will emulate kind of an ILS or any sort of approach where we're trying to fly either a glide path that is being provided for us or one that we're calculating ourselves, and we're going to try to fly a constant rate descent at approach speed. So we're going to try to fly at 70 knots and descend at about 350 to 400 feet per minute, which is about what you'd want to fly a glide path or a glide slope. So what I'll do is I will reduce the power to about 2,100 RPMs, usually between 2,000 and 2,100 RPMs. I will pitch to maintain my speed, and then I will adjust the pitch and the power to get that 350 to 400 foot per minute descent at 70 knots. And this is, again, what you're going to want to practice for practicing those final approach segments when you're flying an ILS or when you're flying a non-precision approach like a VOR approach or a GPS approach where you're calculating your own glide path. This is the type of maneuver that you'll be flying at your approach speed and descending at a specified rate. So again, I'm making kind of fine changes in my pitch to fine tune that descent rate, and then making small adjustments between 100 and 200, sometimes even 50 RPMs to adjust both the airspeed and the descent rate. Another thing you can practice while you are doing this maneuver, once you're comfortable with going straight ahead, is practicing just doing very small turns. Practice turning 10 degrees left and right of your selected heading, and that teaches you how to make small course corrections on something like an ILS or an approach while you're tracking a course. All you want to do is use about, probably about 5 to 7 degrees of bank, and just practice going between 10 and 10 degrees left and right of your course, or left to right of your selected heading, just to get practice in maintaining that descent rate and making those small heading changes to track a course as you're coming down on an approach. And there are two ways we can exit this maneuver. We can level off and attempt to fly another altitude at our specified landing or our approach speed. So we'll do that now. We're coming down to 500 feet per minute, so about 50 feet. We'll put the power back in. Again, the nose should come up kind of its own accord. And this would simulate doing a non-precision approach where we level off at our MDA and then fly until either we hit the missed approach point or until we hit until we get a visual in the field and can actually descend and land. The other way you want to end this maneuver is to practice your go around maneuver. So let's or missed approach maneuver. So let's talk a little bit about that. So another thing you'll want to practice when you're in landing configuration is an idle power descent in the landing configuration. And this is more typically what you would use on what we call the dive and drive type non-precision approaches. So you pull your power to idle, you pitch for your 70 knots, and then you'll be coming down at between 1,000 and 1,500 feet per minute. You may want to add a little bit of power on approaches. This may be a little aggressive of a descent rate, but 1,000 feet per minute on a non-precision where you're trying to get down to your MDA, level off, and then see if you can see the field is not too overly aggressive. 1,500 feet per minute is getting a little up there, so if you're getting close to that descent rate, you probably want to tone it down just a little bit. But you can see we're trending more towards 1,000 feet per minute than we are 1,200 feet per minute. All right, so from this maneuver, let's go ahead and do our missed approach go around maneuver. We'll assume that we have an MDA decision height of about 3,000 feet here. The go around maneuver is exactly the same as it is in VFR. When we hit the decision height or we decide we don't see anything, we'll go ahead and go full power. We'll do one notch of flaps up. We'll pitch towards 10 degrees, being careful not to go below 70 knots. Once we're climbing at a positive rate of climb, we'll go ahead and bring the flaps up to 10 degrees. And now we're just going to pitch for our best rate of climb of about 74 knots. And then as we are above 60 knots, we'll go ahead and retract the flaps all the way up and then just pitch to maintain a best rate of climb of about 74 knots. So pitching up towards about 10 degrees and then just maintaining the pitch to hold that 74 knots. So that is our go around / missed approach maneuver. You'll want to practice that as well. The last maneuver you want to hit is your stall series. Just like your steep turns, the procedure for flying them is the same on instruments as it is for flying it visually, so I won't rehash the procedure in this video. Again, there's a link to the 172 flight checkout video in this video's description if you want to review that maneuver. Just make sure to keep your scan going during the setup and recovery, and make sure that you're confident you can recognize a stall and recover from one while you're flying on instruments. Once you're done practicing, you have a few options if you want to return to the field. You can, of course, get rid of all the clouds if you want and just proceed visually to Pine Bluff. If you'd like to navigate by instruments, just proceed directly to the Pine Bluff VOR. As long as you've remained south of the VOR, you can assume that ATC will clear you down to 2,000 feet and will tell you to advise the field in sight. If you would like to line up directly with runway 36, then you can intercept and track the 182 degree radial, which is a 002 inbound course to the VOR, and that will line you up basically for runway 36. It's not a direct alignment, it's kind of a little bit off to the side, but it's close enough that you'll be able to see the runway really well. If you set the clouds up like we did at the beginning of the video, you should get underneath the clouds once you level at 2,000 feet, and you should be able to pick up the field once you're about 10 miles or so from the VOR. Once you advise the field in sight, you can assume that ATC would clear you for the visual approach, and you can cancel your IFR flight plan. You can then maneuver for a straight into runway 36 if you'd like, or you can enter the pattern for runway 18. That concludes this video. Hopefully it's giving you the skills you need to safely fly your airplane by reference to instruments and giving you some good maneuvers to practice to hone those skills. As always, if you've enjoyed the content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.